Kira, thanks for having me here today. So Charlie gave me a really broad brief, so I brought about 20 pages of notes. I'm kidding. I usually don't write notes, but the reason I brought notes is because this is something that's been percolating in my mind since the whole COVID thing started. And essentially what I want to talk to you about today is not necessarily specifically about trade, I'll get to that in the end, but much more about how I think we're living through history and we're living through regime change. This is the final kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And for me, it's started with the whole kind of understanding of how this thing was affecting us. It has completely reshaped our understanding of economics, politics, the assumptions that we make, the consensus that binds us together. When the pandemic first hit, it was very much a thing that was happening in China. So we thought, oh, let's look at SARS. A week later, we thought, let's look at the GFC. A week later, we thought, let's look at the Great Depression. So the escalation was pretty quick. And so it really rocked us to our core to kind of understand how this was going on. And for me, the thing that really came through was that this is not the first thing that is challenging the ways that we think about our economy and geopolitics and politics. And that's because what happened 10 years ago with the GFC also questioned many of the assumptions that we have made about how the economy works, who wins, who loses, and whether or not the current system of doing things is actually working to deliver the values that we profess to have. My view is that there is a current consensus which has been held together by inertia rather than any real evidence that how we're doing things is actually delivering what we want. And what we're watching right now is a slow degeneration of this post-war rules-based consensus, which has served New Zealand extraordinarily well. It has given us a presence in the global multilateral setting, in trade, you name it. In almost every setting, New Zealand punches above its tiny dot at the end of the world. We actually matter in a global sense, and that is because there is a rules-based global order which has really helped us. I think this is going to be replaced by polarization. On one end, we're going to see a rise of imperialism, and the other has not yet been written. And our role is to write that, and write that with partners who believe in the same values that we have. And that's because we cannot be imperialists. We're not big enough, we're not ugly enough, we're not strong enough. So we're going to have to think some ways to find allies, to find this alternative fork in the path that's ahead. Now, why do I think the pandemic is going to be the catalyst for change? And when you look back through history, what we see is that large change happens only after multiple events build, and suddenly the dam breaks. I'd argue that what we have observed over the last 30 years is the dam has been building. We've been trying to run an experiment of a way of doing politics, economics, consensus, which I don't think can deliver all the things we want. And the inadequacies in particular that it has laid out for me have been around things like our approach to health. We should have been able to deal with a pandemic, yet we were unprepared. We had SARS and MERS, and we refused to learn the lessons of those pandemics. And so we were unprepared when it arrived. We were unprepared when it came to the impact on education. Look at all the kids who are now missing out on their education. On housing, we have the record number of people on wait lists. Welfare, we have suddenly realized that when middle people lose jobs, that actually the welfare payments in New Zealand are not enough to live on with dignity. Or around immigration, that we actually use it as exploitation to run some of our key industries in our country, or that we profess to want better health and education and welfare but refuse to pay more in tax. There is a whole bunch of inconsistencies and dissonance in the way that we think about things. When I look around the world, the rise of populism, anti-globalism, these are not new things. They are a symptom of this lack of faith, lack of consensus that is there around the global integration and cooperation that has really kind of shaped the post-war era, at least in my mind, which was very much a progressive idea that pulled countries together for a number of decades, is now the same idea that is pulling them apart. And I think we must not forget that these things happen through time. Now, I know that I have quite a depressing effect on people, so I wanted to start with a little bit of a case for optimism. And the optimism for me comes from, I think, New Zealand's ability to really find a new path that is the right path. One that is, I think, positive and good for the world and good for us. And the pandemic had a whole bunch of lessons for me. The first for me was around, we have to understand that as humans, we have a whole bunch of foibles, right? We don't understand what risk actually is. When something's in the future, we discount it. We'd rather have the thing that's right in front of us than deal with something that's really scary but in the future. And to me, that is exactly what's happening with climate change, with whether it's poverty, inequality, housing, whatever, you name it. We push everything to the side because we can deal with that later. The consequences of that are not immediate and not right in front of us. And they feel abstract until they whack us in the face, and then we wonder why we got whacked in the face. But also what I found was, through this pandemic, we were able to all become experts on a virus, on a pandemic. We all started talking about our values and how, the virus spreads and whether or not there are merits to the mask or whatever. When we are given a difficult problem, but we're equipped with good information and good communication, New Zealanders are able to find consensus. The level of compliance in New Zealand to the lockdowns was extraordinary. So if you look at things like the Oxford's restrictions index, what really becomes clear is that lots of countries had big restrictions, but very few countries had the level of compliance that we had in New Zealand. What's different about New Zealand is that we bought into what was required. There is a difference there, and I don't care what the political views are. It's much more about we pulled together in a clear show of collectivism and consensus, which to me builds a very strong case for where New Zealand is different from a lot of other places. And when we talk about polarization and loss of the global order, I think these are the things that will put us in good stead. The pandemic will end, right? Right now it kind of feels like it's going on forever, but it's only been 6 months. And we know that in the next 6 months, we're going to find a vaccine and cure and all those other bits and pieces. Things will change. But the impact of the pandemic is not going to go away in 6 months' time. I think it's going to linger. I think when I think about the big issues that are there, we can make the choices that we always have with policies, right? I think what we see a lot of is when we see the problems, the inconsistencies in things, we go, oh, let's tweak the current policies that we have. Surely doing more of the same will get different results. Well, that's the definition of insanity. Or we can try and create new rules. Yeah, we've tried that a little bit too. Ultimately, I think where we're headed to now is we're having to find new goals, new ways of doing things, because what we are trying to do is not the right thing. And what I mean by that is a lot of the consensus that frames our thinking, that puts the boundaries around what we are willing to try, those are the very things that are constraining our ability to innovate and to change the way we do things. And I think people are getting wise to that fact. There are lots of things that New Zealanders claim to value. Apparently, we value housing access for all people, and yet our housing quality is shit. Our home ownership rate is the lowest level since the 1950s. We apparently care about poverty and inequality. Income inequality in New Zealand has not improved for 30 years. 30 years of pretty much steady economic growth, no improvement in inequality. Do you really care about inequality? Why has that not improved if that's the case? Apparently we care about climate change, but we want to make no changes to emissions, to costs, to taxes. There are real inconsistencies. We say that we care about health, education, and justice. We want more and better quality. But at the same time, in the same breath, we say we want lower taxes. There is this inconsistency in the way that we want things. The current ways of doing things haven't delivered what we want. It is getting harder to believe that doing more of the same will get different results. Therein lies, I think, the reason why we're saying change around the world. Where we are now is we're groping towards a new narrative. And when you look back through history, the Great Depression and the World Wars were probably the last time we had that big change in the way we did things. Before that, our economies were very laissez-faire, right? Small government, very few rules. You could pretty much do what you wanted within relative reason. And post that, we really saw the rise of Keynesianism. And then through the 50s and 60s, we saw the rise of monetarism. We saw the invention of independent central banks in the 80s. And those things have held us in pretty good stead. But those things are now a spent force. And in many ways, they became a spent force some time ago. The GFC took care of the central banks. They're no longer relevant. I unsubscribed from a whole bunch of emails from the Reserve Bank because, quite frankly, it doesn't matter. They can send me as many emails as they like, but they're not particularly effective, right? So if they're not in charge, who is? Well, who's in charge is the government. We've gone back in history. And those catalysts for change were very big things, right? Things that kind of went, our ways of understanding the economy no longer works. And that is exactly what's happening in the world. We have been told time and time again that globalization is good. But when you go to the Rust Belt in the US, they don't see it. They don't believe it. And those inconsistencies are important and real because that is what's creating a lot of these shifts in the way that we think about the global order right now. For me, what I think is going to happen is the pandemic is going to push back the power of driving the economy back to governments. And that is kind of scary for me because governments are not equipped to manage the economy because they gave that up decades ago. They don't have the capability. And so we're going to find some really whack stuff happening over the next few years. But we were also asking some big questions, right? Do we need to pay back the hundreds of billions of dollars we're going to borrow? Does it matter? Should we print more money? Should we have MMT? No, they're not necessarily the right answers or right questions, but we're having some conversations that are way bigger. And those taboos that we had for the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years have suddenly vanished. And this is when you start to see change. Around the world, the rise of populism, the backlash against globalizations, and experts, I think has its roots in fragmentation of society across several key ingredients. And the main thing is that the main key ingredient in my mind of those stable democracies is around increased and shared prosperity. That's where we have failed. We have managed to have increased prosperity, but not necessarily well shared. I don't think the future will have the kind of neat, organized consensus that we've had in the last few decades post the world wars. Instead, I think we're living through a regime change. This is a 100-year event. This is the final straw that broke the camel's back. The current regime is over. We don't know what the next one will be. It's one in a series of events that question and corrode the current consensus around our political economy, which has been held together by inertia. And when that inertia goes, what we're going to see is a degeneration of the post-war rules-based consensus. And I'm very confident that it is going to be replaced by some form of imperialism from a bunch of countries that I think you can predict. And there will be no reciprocity in those ties, from those countries. We cannot expect they're going to look after us because you know what? Their shutters are going up and they're going up for everybody, including little old New Zealand. For us, it's really very much about finding a different way. We have to chart a new path. Yes, we have to manage those old ties because these imperialists are going to be big economies, powerful, military, all of those things. But we have to grow new ones because the reality is we cannot trust them to hold their side of bargains. The reason I'm pitching this narrative to you today is because, in my mind, there is only one obvious place where we're going to find our future opportunities and where we're going to find the shared values around progress, optimism, and connectedness. These are values that I think we will find will still exist in certain parts of the world. I think we're going to find that much more in Asia than we're going to find in other parts of the world. This is where we must find our allies for what comes next. But make no mistake, this pandemic is the final straw in creating a change that is going to be very significant. New Zealand has a very big role to play in deciding our future. We have to choose which path we take. Thanks.